Johnny's lecture where he was talking about food allergies and intolerances. Part of the theme that he kind of had was that whole toxic stew that the fetus can be exposed to. So, he really was stressing as far as before somebody goes into pregnancy, as far as kind of cleaning up the act, or trying to get as much immune dysfunction off the board as possible. A lot of focus on microbiome. Microbiome, the gut microbiome specifically, I think that's really the gateway to managing our immune system. We have a lot of tools for that, but I really think working through the gut, where most of the immune system lives, is probably where we get the highest yield. And on top of that, we know there's links between the gut microbiome and the vaginal microbiome. And when the child is delivering through vaginal delivery, that's the first inoculation. That's where the child's gut microbiome starts.
Right, and they're exposed to all those pathogens.
Right, and so I think it's an important point as far as getting that as healthy as you can. Even if the child's born in, say, an emergency C-section, then the gut microbiome is further modulated through breastfeeding in the child. And there is also links between the gut microbiome and what's expressed in the breast milk as well. So I think there's gaps in that. We still don't have full understanding, but we know it's all connected.
What about, have you heard of vaginal seeding? Would that be helpful for the children that are born via C-section? Yeah, absolutely. There was a big study done in, well, it wasn't a big study, but a study was done in Puerto Rico several years ago. And what they did was the vaginal seeding, where they took a sterile gauze and they took samples of vaginal secretions from the mom. And in the children that were born C-section, they would then seed that in the baby's mouth. Then they followed up these kids 6 months later, and they found the ones that they did the vaginal seeding with had less infections, less immune problems than the ones who didn't. Today, the environment, there definitely are a lot of parents that are doing that kind of off-board, like kind of unofficially, right,
when they're in the hospital. I don't know of too many hospitals that are officially endorsing that, but the data's there. I think they just need to show more support of it. And it would be nice to see one day where that becomes a standard protocol in the hospital for any child that's born C-section. A lot of the C-sections, there's some that are elective, but a lot of them are not. And thank God we have C-sections. Otherwise, we'd have a lot of moms and kids that probably wouldn't make it. So
right,
not against C-section.
My son was emergency C-section.
Exactly.
Nolan was.
Right. When you gotta have it, you gotta have it. So, we just need to deal with it and make it the best situation possible. So I think, but again, I think that's something a lot of parents are kind of doing it kind of below board.
Right.
But it shouldn't have to be.
Right.
It should be something endorsed by the hospital because it's a perfectly natural thing. Normally the head's in the vaginal canal for quite some time and the child's swallowing all kinds of secretions.
Right.
That's the natural way it's happened forever. So if we're going to change nature, then we want to try to replicate that piece as much as possible. There was a really interesting term he introduced in the lecture, which I'd never heard before. It was based on a medical article that he'd read called immunodietica. So what this basically was the interaction between diet and autoimmune disease. So it was interesting, and in this study they actually looked at how much immunogenicity or how much immune responsiveness there was in people that were eating primarily vegetables versus beef versus pork. And they actually found pork actually had the most immunogenicity compared to beef, and vegetables having the least. It's interesting when you think about it, because you look at certain religious traditions, like the Muslim faith or Jewish faith, they have prohibitions against eating pork, which we used to think it was because of maybe parasite transmission. That might be one reason. Maybe it has something to do with this as well, because the meat in pork is more similar to our own. That's why we use a lot of pig organs and transplants and whatnot. So if there's something there, like a parasite, which would be more likely to infect a human, or the antigens that are in the muscle, could actually create immune dysfunction. So I wouldn't necessarily stop eating pork now for that reason, but I like pork chops. But but it's something to think about. If you have an immune condition, maybe it'd be worthwhile to cut it out for a little bit and see if it helps.
It's causing an immune response.
Right, it would definitely.
And that's not something that's normally tested on a food sensitivity panel.
I think some of them do, but it's not something that we necessarily always think about.
Right.
And what was interesting was that some of the interactions that they saw when they were testing it wasn't strictly just IgG. IgG is what your typical ALCAT test will
Right, and
test.
I was actually going to ask if for the viewers you could explain the different, the IgE, the IgA, IgG.
Yeah, and this is perfect timing because what John really did talk about,
Okay.
this is like his baby, is the food testing.
Right,
So you have basically your classic food allergy testing, which is IgE. And that's like your peanut allergy or anaphylaxis or
like a true severe
right.
allergy.
That's a true allergy. They're typically lifelong. There is some cases of reversal on it, but not as common. It's certainly not temporary. And it's typically when you see that, you try to desensitize to at least not make it life-threatening, and then
Right.
you just tell the person to avoid it for the most part. And IgE is a very specific part of the immune system that's pretty much implicated in allergies and parasites.
Okay,
And there's really not much else. So for most of our history on this earth, IgE was involved in fighting parasites. That's how infested we were for
so that's
most
one
of our
way to
existence.
check for a parasitic infection is IgE level.
Absolutely. If you see a high IgE and there's no signs of allergy, definitely I would think parasite. In our society, for the most part, it's allergies when we see it elevated.
That's the first time I've heard that, so that's good information.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, our immune system made a whole special section just for that. That's how
Right.
ubiquitous they were with us on our everyday life. Then you have IgA, which is your secretory, that's in your secretions, your snot, your gut secretions, vaginal secretions, tears, all these things. And then you have IgG. IgG is in the blood. It's more of a long-term response. Now, when we see IgG to a food, that's what we would call food intolerance.
Or sensitivity.
Yeah, or sensitivity. There's some of the tests, unfortunately, use the word allergy, which I wish they wouldn't, because it does confuse the issue. It's not an allergy. You can call it intolerance, you can call it sensitivity, but it's not an allergy. Food allergy is a specific entity with IgE, and it's not typically reversible.
Right.
IgG, food intolerance or food sensitivity, if you do the gut work and you heal the leaky gut, you avoid the food for some time, usually 3 to 6 months, you can see reversals on this. There are some food intolerance or sensitivities which are IgG mediated, which persist. I've seen that in some kids, but for the most part, they do tend to reverse. If you don't fix that disrupted barrier, that leaky gut, what we see instead is this sort of merry-go-round of intolerances, where you'll see a clump of intolerances come up on the test. The parents will cut that food out, kid will get better. 3 to 6 months later, they sort of go back to where they were. You check it again, a whole new group now of intolerances, which is pretty much what they've been feeding them. So it's very frustrating for the parents because it seems like no matter what they change the child's diet to, the child becomes intolerant to it. So when you see that pattern, that is a huge red flag for there's some serious gut issues, and these
Right.
antigens are crossing the barrier, so you need to kind of address that, or you're just going to keep playing this, kind of musical chairs with the food sensitivities. The food allergy or food sensitivity. See, I just said food allergy. Food sensitivity
You're a
testing.
hypocrite.
That's right. I do food allergy testing sometimes, but usually it's food sensitivity testing. The one I like using is a KBMO test, which looks at IgG plus complement.
Okay.
Complement is this very primitive part of our immune system that typically when it's elevated, it should be clinically relevant always, because we find it in bees and ants and cockroaches. It's very conserved in very primitive animals. So I like that test more because a simple IgG test, we tend to get more false positives
Okay.
versus when we do it with complement. One interesting thing actually was when Dr. Theohardis lectured, he was actually talking about what he does before he does food sensitivity testing. I thought this was very interesting because what I usually tell my patients to do is I do it typically in about the middle of a gut reset. We tend to cut down on the false positives if we've already partially treated the leaky gut. But and then I tell them they're usually on some kind of restricted diet like low FODMAP or anti-candida or low histamine, something like that. I tell them to diversify their diet for about a week before, eat as diverse a diet as possible, because if you have a child that hasn't touched gluten for 6 months, even if he's sensitive, it probably won't light up if he
Right.
doesn't expose himself to it. So if they're unsure if he's sensitive, I ask them to reintroduce it. Now what he brought up was he has his patients eat a very bland diet for the 3 days before the food sensitivity test, typically like a chicken and rice and nothing else.
Right.
And his reason is that, so any foods that you eat on a daily basis, day in and day out, can also create a false positive. So he has them do this bland diet to eliminate that. And I found that very interesting. That's something I think I'm going to probably incorporate in my practice, because that really is the goal, is to cut down the false positives. I mean, you know, families we're talking about, they got enough on their plate, and the kid's already a picky eater and all these things, and now
I have seen kids where they're allergic to everything, but the idea is that they have leaky gut. Everything's passing through and causing an immune response.
Right.
Which could be the false positive.
When I see the food sensitivity tests come back with, you know, greater than 15 foods, 10 foods, 15, 20, to me, that I don't know what they're positive to. All that tells me is they have just
severe leaky gut. Yeah.
And they probably are positive to a couple of those foods, but most of them are probably wrongly implicated. So in which case, if you cut all those foods out, yes, it will help the child, but in 3-4 months, you'll be right back to square one, only it'll be a whole new set of foods that you spent all this time and effort changing the diet just to have them resensitized to it, which to me is...
And sometimes there are foods that have a lot of the nutrients to it. So if you're removing all these things that are nutrient dense, you also run into the problem of, is my kid getting enough nutrients and a variety of different nutrients?
Absolutely. And that can be a challenge, you know, especially in a lot of our kids, we don't even know, we don't know necessarily how much nutrients they're absorbing. So at the very least, we want to make sure what we're delivering to them, and as far as diet, is going to be well balanced.
Right.
So, and even with that, sometimes they still don't absorb all of them. So, you know, at the very least, we want to at least give them that option.
Right. Really quick, on some of these food sensitivity panels, when it comes back, I've seen some of them where it's graded on a scale of 1 to 4. So so 1 would be severe, or? Usually the 4 is more severe, and then the 1 is less. Would you still remove the foods that are like in the 1 and 2 zone? Or do you tend to focus on? I focus on 4+, 3+, 2+. Okay.
Now keep in mind that when I do these, I'm usually doing them with either I don't have a suspicion that the child has leaky gut, in which case I can do it right off the bat.
Is that pretty rare?
Yeah, but it happens occasionally, and in adults it's more common, I would say. And then number 2, if I do think there's leaky gut, then I'll usually do it in the middle of a gut reset where we're trying to sort of rehabilitate the microbiome, fix the leaky gut. In those situations, typically I'll see less than 10 positive foods come up, between 4+, 3+, 2+. The 1+ foods, what I usually tell parents is, look, keep an eye out on it. If there's an obvious sensitivity, sure, I would absolutely cut it out. But for the most part, I'm not sure how clinically relevant the 1+ are.
Right.
But again, if they, you know, if green peas are 1+, and every time they eat them, their cheeks turn bright red.
That's those mast cells in the histamine response.
Right.
And this is where taking data on your child's behavior in correlation to different things you're giving them is so important.
Don't trust your memory.
Right.
Because we all think we have better memories. Because it all just blends together. We have too many things, most of us, I should say, have too many things going on. You know, if we're going to be making treatment decisions on, you know, adding or eliminating foods, or adding or eliminating supplements or medicines, or whatever it is, we don't want to go off memory.
Right.
We don't. It's just, I don't think it's fair to the child.
You want to see a correlation when I give it on this days, I'm seeing this behavior happen.
Right. You know, whatever system works for you, just use something. Just don't trust in that. The next lecture I wanted to talk about was Dr. Baker, Sidney Baker's. He kind of had a great
and what is his title again?
Sidney Baker, he's a medical doctor, pediatrician. He is in his 80s. He has been practicing a very long time. The kind of MAPS field really look up to him, or kind of view him as a, you know, kind of guiding light. He's very, he talks a lot about medical history, medical philosophy. You know, he's like sort of the sage, elder of the group. So he does a lot of work actually with HDCs, which are where you're actively giving a parasitic treatment to the child in hopes of toning the immune system. So he does the HDCs. So his lecture was basically about the integrative approach to pediatric allergy. And there's some very interesting points I got from it. The one that I really loved, I wanted to kind of share was, you know, the person who introduced the word allergy to the general public and the medical community was back in 1906. And he was a French doctor, Clement von Puriquet. I probably said it wrong, but he was actually ostracized by his colleagues for coming up with this crazy idea of allergy, which is so ubiquitous. I mean, I don't think anybody in their right mind would deny that allergy is a real thing today. right? So he, which comes to show you that this is not something that people have dealt with throughout humanity. This is a disease of modern society because, he had this innovative idea in 1906, a little over 100 years ago, just to coin the term. Whereas if it was something that we've been seeing since, ancient times, it would just be in our everyday, language.
Right.
But yeah, so this kind of went back, that's what I love about hearing from Dr. Baker. He always brings up these interesting points that I think were really good. He also quoted Yehuda Schoenfeld. Dr. Schoenfeld, he's an Israeli researcher, involved a lot with working with autoimmunity and immune function, particularly the role of vaccine adjuvants, on autoimmunity, which he coined the term actually ASIA, which is autoimmune syndrome induced by adjuvants.
Oh, wow, I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, and he actually put out from his perspective, he basically thinks everything's infectious and cause until proven otherwise, particularly autoimmunity. And he had said this well over 15 years ago. Since that time, they found more and more infectious links with autoimmunity. And I think the classic one everyone knows about is pandas, right, with strep. But it's not only that. I mean, rheumatic heart fever, which also is from strep. That's, a lot of people's great-grandparents or grandparents had that and they had other problems. It's an autoimmune condition triggered by an infection. There's links with Yersinia and Hashimoto's. We're finding more and more links with these infectious triggers. It doesn't necessarily make the autoimmune condition persist, but it at least triggers it. It starts that whole cascade going downhill. So I think that's always something important to keep in mind. He talked a lot about he uses a lot of high-dose magnesium, nystatin to battle the yeast, and of course the HDCs, which were the parasites that he uses in some patients. And these are non-human parasites, I want to be clear.
Okay, so really quick, because I know this is a hot topic for a lot of families. Not all parasites are bad. There are benefits to our microbiome to having some, and nobody should ever have zero parasites.
Right. When you get a parasite test done through a doctor's data or Genova test, those are good for the 60 to 70 pathological parasites that we know about.
And sometimes those could be false negatives.
They can be, and some of them aren't. Like blastocystis is a good example. It can absolutely be a pathogen, but not always. It sort of depends. The parasites are sort of like the top of the food chain, and they prey on a lot of the smaller microorganisms. So if they are present or not present, it can play a pretty big role in whether you're going to get overgrowth of another bug or not. So, this, and I know that it's popular in a lot of ways now. There's a lot of stuff online, and parasite cleanses and all this. And I think it helps for a lot of people tremendously. I'm not questioning that part. But it's not something where, part of it's the language we use, right? The word parasite has a negative connotation. So anything that's parasitic is bad. It needs to be removed. But
and that's what we're trying to change, that way of thinking in some of these families, and not all parasites are bad.
Right. There are definitely commensal parasites, which are parasites that benefit us that probably should be there.
Well, there was some autism studies conducted that they were arguing that could be one of the triggers of autism, is that parasites were missing from the microbiome.
Right. And I've had several cases of my own patients where, the parasites were removed by the family. I wasn't really involved in it necessarily, and the kid got worse.
Oh, wow.
Now, we've had plenty of cases where the kid got better. So, and the problem right now is determining, do you go forward with it or not? And in a lot of cases, we don't have the information, which is difficult. So, the parasites that Dr. Baker grows, called HDCs, they're basically parasites that they come from rat beetle cycle. And the whole idea behind it is we had these grain silos from, the early days of agriculture. And in these grain silos, we would get beetles and rats. And no matter how clean we tried to keep it, we would get beetles and rats in these grain silos, and the grain would be a staple in our diet. So we would have these, sorry for the visual here, but there would be little bits of rat feces and beetle parts in the grain whenever we would make it. Yeah, that's why you probably have to bake it, right?
Yeah, so, kill it off.
So we would get these spores into our diet. I think a more important thing is that they don't survive in the human if you don't redose it,
Right.
And that's, I think, where the safety of his treatment. I've seen some pretty incredible results actually with his treatments.
And how is it administered?
They basically picked them out with a microscope, and they put them into a little solution of water, and you can order 5, 10, I believe it goes up to 60 or 80, so you can get a quite concentrated dose. They
Right.
FedEx it overnight, next day.
It's like a
kid just
liquid?
shoots it.
Okay.
And usually it's dosed about every 2 to 3 weeks. And usually if you're going to have effect, you should see it within a couple of months. As far as safety, there could be some bloating, some upset stomach, nausea. I've only heard of one case where there was an infestation, and that was a case where the child was on chronic steroids from their conventional doctor, which they didn't share with their integrated doctor.
Okay.
So it was a miscommunication, unfortunately.
Right. So it wasn't the treatment necessarily, it was the environment of which the treatment was going into.
It was going into an immunosuppressed person, which I would not recommend that. And then the child was treated with, I believe it was Alinea, like 2-3 days, and they were fine. But yeah, other than that, so that was kind of a special situation. It's mostly just some local reactions, which could be a little bloating, but most kids tolerate it. I actually had my son on it this was several years back, for probably close to 6 months.
Oh wow.
Yeah, he didn't really respond very well with it. Very well tolerated. I mean, it was like no big deal. He just every 2 weeks drank his little water.
So this has been something that's been given for a few years?
Yeah, it's been around for several years. All of the parasites are grown fresh. There's about at least 6 or 7 docs around the country that have what Dr. Baker calls his little dude ranch. So, which is basically you have some rats, you have some beetles, and you basically transfer it through the life cycle, and then you harvest the beetle.
So that's something you're considering here?
No. I wouldn't mind having something like that, but it's pretty labor intensive.
Right.
So for me, it's a lot easier to just send
And on
patients.
your free time?
Yeah, exactly. I think they can order from Dr. Baker directly. And like I said, I think there's some docs on the West Coast and I think South. They have them like kind of regionally, so there's a few of them. But yeah, like I said, it plays a good role when it's necessary. It works quite nicely on allergies and things like that. There's another lecture that they did on a low-dose allergy therapy, or LDA. Yep, LDA. It was Dr. Schrader, who's been practicing LDA on his patients for quite some time now. LDA is, they've got some pretty big shoes to fill. They report a success rate of 75%.
That's huge.
That's huge.
I don't see a lot of treatments with that kind of a success rate.
And very safe. A lot of people have questions about LDA, low-dose allergy therapy, versus LDI, low-dose immunotherapy. They're very similar, but
because allergies and immune system go hand in hand.
Exactly, and and it's the same concept where you're giving very small doses of the allergen or the
to create an immune response.
Exactly. The LDA is given in the skin. They're a little tiny needle. You do the injections in the skin. Because it's in the skin where the nerve endings are, it's painful. So this is something that kind of puts, with kids especially, you can probably sneak up on it once, but after that, they're going to be resistant.
But the good news is, like you said, you only have to give it once every.
Once you get a response to it, the maintenance on it's usually once every 2 to 3 months, so it's not too frequent. If depending on the clinical gains you're getting, it may be worthwhile. Nobody wants to cause pain in their child.
Right.
Another way to do it is sublingual, which you can do with LDA. The problem is you actually have to hold it sublingually for a good 5 minutes to get absorbed.
5 minutes.
Or they say 2 to 5 minutes, depending on how much
Yeah.
saliva you have.
That would be very hard for.
Right, a lot of adults have trouble doing that. So I think on adults it's a reasonable option, but with kids, I've never had much luck.
Even 60 seconds can be difficult for a child. So.
Right. Well, it's that time dilation. kids, 5 minutes to a child is a long time, right? It's just the way they view time. LDI is done almost exclusively sublingually, so I think it has less application for the patients we're talking about for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
Also, LDI is much more dilute than LDA. They're both considered homeopathic dilutions, but LDA is really at the barely diluted end of it. They're doing like a 6x, 4x, 3x, things like that. Whereas the LDI is done more at a 20C, 40C much larger dilutions. I think they both can be very effective because when you're talking about immunotherapy, a little goes a long way, especially if you got it in the right place. I think the last difference between them is LDA uses an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase that it mixes it in. LDI does not necessarily.
I'm not going to remember that.
Yeah, well, it is. There's a lot of debate on it. I mean, the people who use LDA swear by this and they say it's really important. People that use LDI say it's not that important. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say on that. I mean, it's a difference of opinion, but I think it's a naturally occurring enzyme in our body. You're giving very small amounts of it. I mean, again, if the numbers that they report for LDA are true, it's hard to argue with the 75% success rate.
Definitely at least worth pursuing or trying.
Absolutely, right. And yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, I thought this was kind of nice how he kind of outlined it in the lecture. You know, there's different types of immune failure, and I think this is something that people get really confused about because they tend to think of immune system as like one entity, right, doing one thing. But it's really not. I mean, it really has two primary functions. And the first is defense, right? We all know about that one, right? It stops us from getting sick. And the other one's tolerance, where it has to tolerate what's already there. And, and what we're finding now is, I mean, the defense is definitely a problem. You know, if you're constantly getting infection after infection, that's going to cause trouble. But if you can't tolerate what's already in your body, that's a whole other problem. Now, in each of these categories, you have what comes from outside the cell to what's from inside, right? So like with defense, if you have a defect from the outside, then what you're going to get is recurrent infections. So that's one type of immune dysfunction where a person just gets sick and then a week later they're sick again and they're sick again and they're sick again. Now, if that's happening from inside, what you see is cancer.
Right.
So cancer is sort of the flip side of infection, right? And I think it's important to conceptualize it that way so that people have a better understanding of how the immune system works. Then when you go to tolerance, it's the same thing. Like in defense, the kind of outside was infection, inside was cancer. When you go to tolerance, outside is allergy, inside is autoimmunity.
Okay.
So they're, different sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
The allergies from stuff coming from the outside. Now granted, autoimmunity has a trigger, which maybe starts that whole cascade going, and removing the triggers is hugely important. But it can get a life all of its own once that trigger is gone. And I suspect I have a good chunk of patients with autoimmunity, we never find the trigger.
Right.
Which makes me wonder, are there cases where there are no triggers, or at least that we can't find? We don't know.
Their body just in this constant state of
it just got into this.
itself.
Right, it's just immune dysregulated, and it's just on high alert, and it's got to kill something, and it's going to kill your joints or your thyroid.
What can also be frustrating for parents too is sometimes an infection doesn't always present itself as being sick, where there's a fever or a cough or a runny nose. It could manifest in behavior.
Absolutely. Well, and I think chronic occult infection, like that chronic hidden infection. Occult just means hidden. A lot of people hear the word occult and they think of like ceremonies and robes and Wiccans and whatever. Yeah, all it means is hidden, right?
Right.
That's all it means. So when they say chronic occult infection, it just means a chronic hidden infection. I think there's a lot more of that than we realize.
Well, like the pandas kids, they might have underlying strep infection, but they're not presenting the sore throat. They're presenting in the OCD behaviors and.
Matter of fact, a majority of them don't really even have a lot of those symptoms, or they maybe if you have a good history and the parents remember, maybe it started off with those symptoms, but rarely is that persisting once their behavioral stuff really takes off.
Because it becomes their new norm.
Right. So how many of these cases are related to some other type of infection? And I think this is a whole area where there's just so much to look into.
Right.
And I think this is where I think actually LDA, and LDI probably to some extent can be quite promising, because part of the desensitization is to infectious agents. They've done a lot of work linking a lot of autoimmune agents to infectious agents, and it's actually the dilutions of the infectious agent that they're doing the LDI the LDA into the skin, the injections, and they've had some good luck with that. And this is one of those things that I wish more providers kind of get on board with this, because this is going to be something where it's going to be a large trial and error, and this is where we get that feedback from hundreds or even thousands of providers doing it. and the provider could be doing it for years, and he could be the one that makes the connection between this infectious agent and this disease. Well, if we get enough people doing that, we start having a list of these things.
Seeing a pattern.
Exactly, seeing those patterns. So I have high hopes for it to get good adoption and usage among providers.
So I am familiar with the NAET allergy treatment for autism. How is that different from this? Because that is kind of exposing the allergen at small doses.
I think the concept is the same, the core concept. I think it's more about how the exposure is made. I'm not an NAET practitioner, so maybe I don't know all the details.
Well, the LTA is exposing the antigen, and then the NAET is the actual substance it's causing.
Well, they're doing that as well.
Okay.
So I think there's some difference in what they're exposing them to, but I think they're both based on the principles of homeopathy, right?
Okay.
Which is like produces like, right?
Right.
And if you do it diluted enough, it kind of settles it down. To my knowledge, the NAET doesn't do the injections into the skin. I think they're doing it mostly sublingually or nasally, intranasally.
Right.
I think the problem in that is making sure that there's a good presentation of the substance to the immune system. I think with kids that either can't keep it under their tongue or they have rhinitis, and we're talking about a kid who might have allergies. Well, what are the chances he's got all snot in his nose all the time?
So how is it going to be absorbed if you're giving it intranasally?
And I think that's where, because I've talked to some parents that have had some great results with NAET. So I think it's sound as far as what's happening in there. And again, I want to be clear. I mean, there's probably details of it maybe I'm not aware of. So if I'm not giving it full credit here, excuse me.
Disclaimer: he's not an NAET practitioner.
No. So if you know someone who's done good with it, I mean, my big thing is I always keep an open mind for any treatments.
Right.
As long as it's not going to harm the child, you got to try different things, and that's how we find these things.
Right.
So, but I definitely think that this whole, all of these different therapies, whether it's allergy desensitization, which is the classical one, which that was actually the next lecture on it, which is just the old-fashioned allergy desensitization, like you go to your allergist and they give you a little bit, and then a little less, and a little less. That works. I mean, it actually has got pretty good evidence behind it. It's very labor-intensive and not comfortable, but insurance usually covers it, so there's a lot of pluses to it.
Right.
So we don't want to knock that. I mean, that works, right? But these are sort of other things. But they're all in the same vein, whether we're talking about that, LDA, LDI, NAET. What they're trying to do is calm down that immune response or allergic response, because it's fueling that fire in the kid's brain, which is really what our real goal is, to take that fire out.
Right.
And that's why I wanted to talk about that plenary session, at the MAPS conference. I think they chose it quite well, because I think that's really a critical thing in our kids. And I think the more awareness that we have of it, not just on the provider end, but on the parents as well, because they're the ones that are seeing the behaviors.
Right.
I mean, all of the treatment is based on what they're reporting, because every time you're asking, how's your kid doing, and if you say not well, then everything I've done I assume it's not working, or you say it's doing great, or he's doing, so I think because we're putting so much emphasis on that reporting, I think it's important for the parents to have an idea of kind of what's going on. And in the case of immune dysfunction, I think it's a very, very small number of kids that don't have this involved in their disease process. I mean, in my practice, I can't think of any, frankly. I mean, they all do to some extent. And even today, the neurotypical kids, forget about autism. Let's talk about neurotypical kids and immune dysfunction. Just the amount of allergies, and we're seeing autoimmune disease coming up at different ages now. Like the strangest thing I'm seeing now are type 1 diabetics that are getting diagnosed. Well, not just so. It's classically in children and teenagers. We're seeing people now come up with it at like the age of 30 or 35, which in the past we didn't see that. If you didn't get it at a certain age, you were kind of safe.
What has changed? What's triggered it?
Something's different. So I think that this is it's definitely a topic of interest in autism, but even just broader, what's happened to our healthcare in general. I think it's something that we all need to talk about. so a lot of the roads lead back to our environment, food, all the other things. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. Right?
There's so much focus on things like heavy metals and diet and this, that, but not a lot of attention being put on the immune system.
That's right.
And mast cells and the histamine link like you were discussing.
So we were kind of talking about some of the differences between the two. I guess one of the other things I wanted to bring up about LDA was some of the conditions that are treated by it. I mean, obviously allergies, asthma, those kind of things would be treated. But some things that are not so obvious, like food intolerances, food allergies, eczema, chronic ear infections. According to Dr. Schrader, they've had really good results with that. And one of the things was migraine as well, because there is a school of thought that migraine, and as far as autistic kids are concerned, how many of them get migraines? Who knows?
Especially if they're nonverbal and they can't communicate what's hurting.
Right, but I mean, if you want to think about it in terms of someone has a migraine for a day, day and a half, you have a child whose behavior completely deteriorates and regresses for a day, day and a half. For people who suffer from migraines, they know that their own performance and behavior certainly regresses during those periods. So I don't think it's a crazy idea that that could be involved. But I think for those higher functioning kids that can communicate, or even for adults to get migraines, LDA, they have shown some resolve with it. The trick really is trying to figure out, it's not like there's a migraine remedy that you inject.
Right.
You kind of have to figure out what you think the root cause is or what the trigger is, and you want to work on that.
So LDA would only work if the trigger was a histamine release, or?
Not necessarily, it could, but it also could be something if you suspect. They have a formulation called multiple chemicals, and they mix in there like benzene, xylene, very, very, very different amounts. For migraines, that's probably where I would start, because I do think that a lot of these chemical intoxicants that we breathe in from car exhaust or diesel exhaust, I think those are triggers in a lot of cases. So I think there's some areas where you could probably start, but it could be gluten, for instance.
Right.
They have different things, but you have to kind of target what you think is driving it. So I think that's where it can get a little bit tricky. The other 2 days at MAPS, I was going to kind of talk about those, but probably not in kind of as much detail as a plenary session. They had a track for genetics, and then there was also an advanced clinical applications. These were outside of the kind of standard MAPS tracks that a lot of the attendees will do to say they're a MAPS doctor. So this was kind of more advanced stuff because it wasn't in the foundations.
I did see on their website there was 2 different levels of being a MAPS practitioner.
Right.
And
so what happens usually is the practitioners will sign up for the conferences and go through the 6 to 8 core modules so that they got the basic knowledge, and then they purposely will at each of the conferences they'll always have each conference day for it's something new for the practitioners that have already gone through all those. So it's kind of nice being in those because you see more of the experienced or seasoned practitioners in there. So I found it very enjoyable because there's some really good discussion, like during the Q&A. In one of in the advanced clinical applications, for instance, there was a unit on CBD.
Oh, okay.
And they went into the details, kind of how it works, and in comparison with whether it's got a component of THC in it or whether it's got CBG, which is a precursor, and how it works. And
what did they say about CBG that they're finding good?
Yeah, they're finding good, but it's not nearly as well studied as CBD. I think it's very promising, but the reality of it is if you really look into the hemp plant or marijuana plant, however you want to put it, but hemp would be really what we're talking about, because if we're talking about CBD, it's coming from industrial hemp.
Right.
Versus the THC, CBD mixtures is coming from
full spectrum flower.
Exactly, right. So majority of the CBD comes as CBD isolate, which is this white powdery substance that they purify from mass quantities of industrial hemp, and then they infuse that into some type of oil or liquid or cream or whatever the delivery mechanism is. I think so aside from the CBD isolate, if you look at the actual industrial hemp plant itself, you'll see that there's a whole alphabet of CB, A, B, C, D.
Right, and each one has different functions
Right.
and what it does. But
Right.
CBD seems to be the most broad.
Right, I
treat.
think there's been a lot of interest in CBG,
Mhm.
so I think it's promising. I just think it's, but this is what people were saying about CBD years ago, right? Like
Mhm.
nobody knows anything about it, but yet people were seeing these results. So, from my knowledge, and this is one of the things I really like about CBD is it's very safe.
Mhm.
Typically it's, patients, the worst thing that'll happen is nothing,
Right.
which is good. I mean, it's not good. You just spend $150 on this bottle or something.
You don't really see adverse reactions to
No,
it.
I mean, I think there's can be some worsening of behaviors at the lower doses. Interestingly, at some of the lower doses, you get this paradoxical response.
Right, and I feel
Uh,
like hyperactivity,
Mhm.
parents will report that at a
Right.
lower dose, which is odd. You would think lower is better in most
Right.
cases, but that's not the case for CBD.
Well, and that's where it's just an interesting plant product because it doesn't necessarily kind of follow the rules of dosing, right? Because normally
Right.
less is, in this case, it's almost like less can be more. And
Right.
it can be misleading because parents will do a small dose and the kid will be really hyperactive and then they'll be like, well, geez, if I triple that dose,
This
I
is
don't even
something
want to think
really,
about it.
yeah.
But in reality, maybe not. So I think it's tricky. I think our knowledge base is expanding on that a lot. I mean, you're seeing CBD products now. I just went to the grocery store last night and there was like some CBD ankle balm or
Oh my
something.
God.
I mean, right at the checkout.
A
You know,
CBD bath bomb.
Right. I mean, they're really, they're pushing this product. I think it is a good product. I think, they're talking about anandamide and your endocannabinoid system. I think that is something important. And I like anandamide. I wanted to talk about that a little bit. This is sort of what can be affected by that. And anandamide comes from the Sanskrit word for bliss, basically, and it's our.
Yeah, I'm not
bliss.
familiar with it, so tell me more about what that is.
Well, there's a neurotransmitter called PEA, and it's a supplement that you can get. There's plenty of different people that make
That Miraca one.
You're right. Miraca is
Okay.
one of the ones that I use with my patients. I think it has a nice effect. I think it has an additive effect with CBD. I have not seen any reports on this. This is just anecdotal, just what I've seen. So there's definitely some role that plays in brain function. And I think the question comes down to your endocannabinoid system. I think there's a very broad expression of sensitivity to that. I think there's patients that have a very, kind of unique or very touchy endocannabinoid system and others that are not so touchy. And this is sort of why we see a pretty broad spectrum of effect when people use marijuana as a recreational drug.
Right.
You'll hear very different reports from people who are using the exact same substance. You could even break it down to the exact strain and potency,
Right.
but their effects are very different.
Processed differently in everybody.
Right. One person will have a very positive reaction, another will have a very horrible reaction.
One could pass out after,
Right.
one could be wired.
Right, it's very different, and I don't think it's as dramatic, but I think there's an element of that with CBD as well.
Mhm.
I don't think it's as exaggerated the response, but I definitely think that there are kids I think that are just non-responders, and I hate kind of using that word because it's not really non-responder. They're
You haven't found the right
right.
remedy.
For them to respond, probably will require quite large doses of CBD, which I don't think anybody is comfortable recommending.
Right.
So basically, they are non-responders to the typical doses that we get. But my understanding of the endocannabinoid system is that it's something very well conserved in the animal kingdom. I mean, we're talking very primitive animals have it all the way up to us. So usually, when you're looking at like zoological classification, if you see a system that's very well conserved across different animal kingdoms, even into some cases plants and so on, the lower it goes down that sort of evolutionary classification, usually the more foundational it is to something, the more important it is. And amongst animals, the endocannabinoid system is present. I'm going to say in all, to my knowledge, I don't know of any that don't have it.
Right.
I'd have to check on that, but I'm definitely certain it's almost all, if not all. So it must be important.
Right.
And we only discovered it, I think, about 20 years ago. And inside the word CBD is cannabinoid, right?
Right.
Or cannabis, and actually they coined the term endocannabinoid from that. We named it after a plant essentially that affected us. But that system was, I'm pretty sure it wasn't designed just so we could use hemp
Right.
or marijuana.
Yeah, 20 years ago, let's just design this whole new system in
Right.
our body.
Exactly. I mean, it was there before, and then we happened to find a plant that could activate it. So, it's clearly there for another reason. I think other examples of that are, we've seen that with anandamide, the endocannabinoid system. We were talking about like complement and immunity. I mean, these are all foundational systems. Methylation, mitochondrial function.
Right.
These are all broadly conserved, across all these animal kingdoms. So far, the most common contributors I see to fueling autistic symptoms and behaviors, they tend to fall into those lines, and and this is where I think putting it all together at the end is, to get these answers. Everything nature does is kind of simple and elegant,
Right.
right? And the more complex we have to make an explanation. Usually, I tend to have a feeling we're getting further and further away from the truth, because usually the explanations are fairly simple. And I think, hopefully one day, and hopefully not too far away, when we kind of crack this whole autism thing.
Which I definitely think we're getting closer to.
Yeah, we're getting closer, and I don't think it'll be as complex as people think. I think it'll be very interestingly, fairly simple.
Right.
Not the repercussions of it necessarily, but at least what the actual problem is that's really
The
trying
driving
these
force
kids up. Right.
behind it.
Right. So so that's kind of what I saw this year. Let me see what else.
Did you do any workshops while you were there? Do they have workshops?
No, they don't really do. But the advanced clinical applications was kind of a workshop because it was a smaller group. It was like a very kind of it was a lecture, but it was more of like a guy talking with a discussion going on.
Right.
Because it wasn't a big group, so it was pretty interesting. They talked. We did quite a bit of time on IV chelation.
Okay.
And different protocols for that. That was actually that was good.
So I know a lot of parents are doing chelation with their kids. What did you learn about IV chelation? What kind of chelators were they using? And
They talked about DMSA, EDTA, DMPS, all these. I don't do IV chelation in my practice, but I know practitioners that do, and they've had some good reports with it. I think the key message he was putting across was documentation, staying on top of everything, which I think was a good message.
Right.
I think it's something that can be done safely, but it has to be done very conscientiously, and you have to have a practitioner who's really on top of it, who's experienced.
I think there's definitely a lot of misconception where you hear the word chelation and you think it's automatically IV, it's dangerous, but that's not true. A chelator could be something as simple as cilantro or chlorella.
Yep. Yeah, I think I like oral chelating agents. I definitely utilize those. But I actually still think you have to have precautions when you do that. They can be quite powerful. And again, the key is, I think there's an element of possibly some behaviors are worsening, but you have to temper that versus you need a practitioner guiding you to give you at least a framework of saying, look, maybe up to a week this is okay.
Right.
And I'm not saying a week's okay if you're giving chelating. I'm just using that as an example. You'd have to, you really have to tailor it personally to your kid, and you have to talk to your doctor. That is not. I think it's something that if you're doing it, you just have to be conscientious and be very aware of what your child's going through. I think
And kind of understanding the role of metals as they're moving out of the body. What other systems is it affecting, like the adrenal glands, and how could it be damaging the gut while you're doing this, or damaging the liver? And there's so many different elements, not just taking this chelator and calling it a day.
Right. I think it can be done safely. I think it can be done also at home. I just think that when people do it, they, we talked about ACC, previously, like the Andy Cutler creation. I mean, I like how he's laid out some very specific guidelines for parents to follow. I think the way he has it dosed, I think it's
gentle.
Yeah, it's gentle. It's slow. I think it can be safe. The reason I don't want to say safe just right off the bat is it's dependent on if you have a parent who's just not watching how the child's doing. Anything
could be dangerous or safe.
Right. You just have to be aware that if your kid's now on his third week of behavior regression and doing poorly, maybe you're barking up the wrong tree, or maybe you
Right.
need to back off. So you need those sort of guidelines, to follow in there. And I think he gives those guidelines, so.
Right.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that it can be done. But I think a lot of people will, I've unfortunately seen this too, where people want to jump to detox without changing lifestyle. You got to change lifestyle first in terms of how is the garbage getting in there in the first place,
Right.
There's no.
You don't want to add to the problem while you're fixing it.
Exactly.
Make the burden worse.
Right. I mean, if you have identified a source, cut the source out. If you're not sure of the source, do just general guidelines in terms of living a clean life.
Right.
Make sure your water's clean. Make sure your air is as clean as can be. One way you can do that is changing the filters in if you have central air or heat, or you could even get some of these standalone air filters. They typically, you can only do them you can put them throughout the whole house. Most people use them in the bedroom, because the bedroom is where the person spends at least a third of their life, if not more.
And during sleep, that's when the body's healing.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to be exposing them to more toxins
Exactly.
while they're sleeping and healing.
I think some of those kind of low-hanging fruit, trying to keep as clean a diet as possible, kind of eliminating the processed foods. And I think this is one topic I've talked to quite a few families about, where, they're still eating a primarily processed food diet, but they found all the organic processed food, right? I would actually rather... It
is the lesser of two evils, maybe, but...
Well, where I'm sort of debating right now, and I don't know if I know the answer to this, but I tend to be leaning towards, I would probably have a person have a whole food diet that's not all organic.
Right.
Versus a, 99% processed food organic diet. There's pros and cons on both sides.
Well, people think if it's organic, they're not getting any pesticides, but that's not true, because our water supply, our soil supply, the air, there's pesticides everywhere. So you might be limiting, but you're not getting rid of it.
Right. Well, in the United States, the organic label actually does mean you can have up to 10% pesticide residue on the food. In Europe, it's 1%, so it's quite a big difference.
Right.
So, look, 10% is better than 99%. So
right.
I'm not knocking it, but it's not completely free. I think another issue is processed food. The act of processing the food, you lose nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if it's organic or not organic or whatever it is. So of course.
And then there's preservatives.
Right. And the nice thing I think with organic food is that the preservatives will be more on the natural side.
Right.
As far as like flavor enhancers go, like MSG and things like that. There's
which can be hidden under so many different
absolutely.
names.
And that's in processed food, because you're basically eating, leftovers for the most part. They do work a lot on the flavor enhancement piece of it, so they almost all have some element of that in there. It just won't say MSG on it. It'll say natural flavor, or it'll say, it's soybean isolate. There's a whole list of names that you can get under it. Be careful with that. That's something we know enhances glutamate toxicity.
Right.
Most of our kids.
Organic glutamate is not better than.
No, organic
glutamate is glutamate.
Right, exactly. And glutamate, there's definitely an imbalance. Glutamate GABA. So we don't want to promote any more glutamate than we need to. I wanted to quickly mention glutamine versus glutamate.
Right. I know there's been confusion with that.
Right, there's been some with that. There theoretically certainly can be a conversion.
Right.
But I can tell you, I've used a lot of glutamine on kids doing gut resets and whatnot. Never had an issue with it.
We've started using it in our house and seen great results.
Right. So I don't, although it's theoretical, I'm sure there's a child where it could do that. So, if your kid starts stimming off, the deep end, watch it, of course.
Yeah.
But I think generally speaking, though, we don't see that.
Mm-hmm.
I think you get a lot more glutamate toxicity from all the hidden MSG in foods, which is very hard to avoid if your kid is primarily on a processed food diet.
Right.
And that's, to me, the biggest advantage of a whole food diet. And sometimes with a whole food diet, you can't get everything organic, it's just not available. That's where I would say, that's okay, give them the conventional cucumber then. It's a whole cucumber.
Right.
Maybe just wash the skin really good and peel it.
Mm-hmm.
There's still some residue left, but it helps.
Right.
But I think some of those things, when we're talking about toxicity, start with lifestyle before jumping to the actual treatment, because you want to stop the influx in. And in some cases, you may not even have to go further than that.
Right.
You know, and if you don't, good. The less stuff you got to do to your kid, the better. You know, so, you know, but I think that,
Or even like turning your Wi-Fi off at night is another
right.
good one that helps kids, and it's so easy to do.
Right. You know, the only challenge I've had with that now is there seems to be more and more homes that are their Wi-Fi, their doorbell and their lights and their heater. So
Alexa and
so yeah, I'm not crazy, but I get the convenience of the integration, but unfortunately that doesn't allow you really to turn it off.
It doesn't mean that you're not still picking up energy waves from the houses next to you, or
right. You can't really take care of that. But the thing about EMFs, they do drop off by distance quite a bit. So you know, if you look at the amount of EMFs that are from a foot away from the router to 10 feet, I mean, it's a massive drop in energy. You know, so the one thing in I think that we have in our defense is distance, and I think the wireless industry, I think, is definitely aware of that. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with the 5G implementation. I've actually heard both sides of it. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think we have to wait till it's implemented. My understanding of it is it's in some ways better because the old 4G network was what's called an always-on network. So it would basically blanket a neighborhood with the antenna, and it would just constantly have a signal at all times.
Right.
The 5G network is a much smaller radius. They're going to be putting them on lampposts.
Okay.
So the radius extends basically a little beyond where the lamppost is.
So there's just more frequent spots of it.
And it gives a more intense EMF field when there's a person that's needs the EMF. Like you turn your phone on and you're retrieving your email.
If it's finding devices that are looking for an internet connection.
If that's the case, I would probably say then that 5G is better as far as exposure.
Right.
I don't know if that's exactly, who knows if that's actually how it works. I think only time will tell.
That might be a relief for some people to hear.
Yeah, I hope that's like that because I know it's right now in the neighborhood I live in, they're doing the implementation. They're putting it in the streetlights right now. I know here, we're in Las Vegas area. The strips have 5G now for over a year. They already implemented it there. Now it's coming out to the kind of outskirts of town. So again, I think time will tell, but there's a little bit of silver lining to that. In which case, and that reassures me that they're, as we move forward in this, wireless connected world that we now live in, that they're going to refine this, just like the first cars, spewed out black smoke as they drove around, right? And they, they made the car exhaust cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. It's still car exhaust. You still don't want to, put your face on it or anything, but.
Don't you think our bodies over time will adapt to these things too? Like they'll learn to process these things better, and it's not always going to be as toxic to us as it is.
Well, that's part of
kind of like a desensitization, or your cellular level might change over time to accommodate the new things that we're exposed to.
Well, I think we're seeing a bit of a selection now. I think in people that don't have great detox capacities, I think have a tough time in our world.
Right.
I think they, so, and these were people that didn't necessarily have to deal with these kind of things in the past. So, I think evolution's always looking for new things to select for.
Right.
And we're definitely we've all met that person who smokes and drinks and eats McDonald's every day and is perfectly fine, and they're just bulletproof no matter how
That's my husband.
poorly, no matter how poorly they live their life, just nothing affects them.
He never gets sick.
Right. And it's hard pressed to make a case that they should clean up their life because they feel fine. So what do you say? You're like, okay, it's good for you, But those, I don't think those people are common, but I think if things continue the way they are, they will become more common.
Right.
Because those are people that are going to thrive in this environment, right? I think we're not talking generations. I don't think even in our lifetime we may not see that, but yeah, ultimately that'll happen, for sure. But I like the other idea better, that maybe these regulatory agencies, we kind of work together with them and just nobody's saying we're going back to the 16th century and living in huts and
it's not realistic.
Right. We work together to make these things as safe as possible.
Right.
And that's where this kind of new paradigm, we see it a lot in social media where it's just some topics you just don't talk about, like they're forbidden. That doesn't help anybody. You got to have an active discussion about things, and we live in such a polarized society. It's like or not being allowed to do that. And that doesn't help anybody because, all these things, even the so-called bad things, there's always good to be found in anything.
Right.
You just have to work to
And even the
make it
safest, healthiest things to certain degrees could be toxic.
Absolutely.
So it's all about finding a good balance.
Right, and you don't find that balance without an open discussion and people communicating. And that's probably my biggest fear is seeing that shut down discussion because that's the main reason I like going to MAPS every year. Yeah, in summary, the MAPS Fall 2019 conference. It was a great conference. There was a lot of focus on immune dysfunction and allergy. They kind of further elaborated on the key role of mast cells, the importance of going into a pregnancy sort of in the best immune shape you can. That's
like preventative measures.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest prevention that a person can do is go into preconception and actually pregnancy as healthy as you can be.
Right.
LDA I think is, and LDI to some extent is I think a kind of exciting new, I put new in quotes, it's not really that new.
Just a hot topic now.
Right. And like I said, if those success numbers pan out, 75%, that's pretty impressive numbers. There was a lot of talk on genetics, which we didn't really get into much today. Maybe
And do another, the SNPs that we mentioned in the beginning.
Right. We talked a little bit about it, but there was kind of a lot of talk about that, specifically about mTOR and autophagy.
And each of these things that we've discussed, whether it's reducing a toxic burden at home or changing the diet, we can go into more discussion on a separate.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So we were just kind of covering the basics of what was discussed this year.
Absolutely. I think there's definitely a lot. Every year, I think we get closer and closer to getting a better idea of what's going on. So it's
and it's reassuring to know that every year they're coming out with new topics to discuss. So if you have a doctor that is a MAPS doctor, then you're knowing that they're getting the latest information and treatments, and your child's in good hands.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, and that's a group of docs. I mean, I'm always impressed with the group because there's just in my mind, I haven't seen a more dedicated group. We had a little contingent I saw that came over from Brazil. It was like 8 or 9 docs, and they traveled all the way from there. Huge problem down there. And I guess there's rapid industrialization going on in the last 20 years. But this is just kind of one example. But it's, I think it's a very dedicated, tight-knit group of docs that are practitioners that really want to.
And for the families that are new to learning about MAPS doctors, there's not MAPS doctors in every state or city. So sometimes, like Dr. Nick, for example, does remote appointments. So if you don't have one where you're living, you could look into getting one that does those Skype or video appointments. You don't have to necessarily travel if that's not an option for you.
Yeah, if you Google MedMaps, they have a clinician directory. See if there's one local in your community. I think it's always better to have a local doc, especially when you can see live for physical examination.
Right.
But if that's not available, I think that's a reasonable option to do remote consultation, and especially if you're watching some abroad in a foreign country. There are still, unfortunately, not too many MAPS doctors in other countries, but that's growing little by little, I think.
Oh, that's hopeful to hear.
Right.
All right, well, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.